The restaurant The Golden Crown in Polanco, one of the most exclusive neighborhoods in Mexico City, sparkled under the light of crystal chandeliers. The pianist softly played melodies by Agustin Lara as the diners, dressed in designer suits and sparkling jewelry, chatted amidst discreet laughter and the clinking of champagne glasses. The place was frequented by politicians, business people, and celebrities who sought both to be seen and to enjoy the exquisite cuisine of Chef Sebastian Ruiz, a multiple Michelin-starred winner. When Mr. John Monroe and his daughter Lucy crossed the glass doors of the establishment, a subtle shift in the atmosphere was noticeable. Their simple yet clean clothing contrasted sharply with the opulence of the regular patrons. Mr. Monroe, in his freshly pressed white shirt and dark trousers, and Lucy in a simple floral dress, stood out like misplaced pieces in a puzzle of luxury. Richard Vance, a 25-year-old waiter with ambitions of one day becoming the restaurant's maître d', watched them with disdain from the reception desk. His perfectly groomed eyebrows arched as he saw them approach. "How may, sir? I help you?" he asked with a smile that didn't reach his eyes. His tone suggested they might have taken a wrong turn. "Good evening," replied Mr. Monroe with the calmness of someone who has worked under the sun all his life. "I'd like a table for two, please." Richard glanced discreetly at the reservation book, though he already knew there were tables available. He hesitated for a few seconds before picking up two menus. "Follow me, please," he said in a condescending tone. He led them to the farthest corner of the restaurant, near the swinging kitchen doors, where the noise of dishes and the heat from the stoves were evident. It was the worst possible spot. "You'll be comfortable here," he commented with a malicious smile as he exaggeratedly pulled out the chair for Lucy. The 17-year-old, with the dignity she had learned from her father, sat down without comment, though her eyes reflected her discomfort. Mr. Monroe noticed the sideways glances from the other diners, but maintained his impeccable composure. "Thank you," he replied with a genuine smile that momentarily disconcerted Richard. The waiter took almost 20 minutes to return to take their order, during which he deliberately ignored their attempts to get his attention. When he finally approached, he did so with a notepad in hand and an impatient expression. "Have you decided what you'll order? I can recommend the beef Wellington with black truffle sauce. It's quite affordable at just $250, he suggested, emphasizing the price with malice. "That sounds delicious," replied Mr. Monroe without flinching. "We'll have that along with a bottle of mineral water for both." The surprise on Richard's face was evident, but he quickly recovered. "As you wish," he replied with false courtesy. Throughout the dinner, the treatment didn't improve. The dishes were practically thrown onto the table, water was accidentally spilled near Lucy, and questions about the food were answered with disdainful monosyllables. Lucy kept her gaze down for much of the evening, but Mr. Monroe ate with the calm of someone who savors every bite, showing no sign of annoyance. At the end of the meal, Mr. Monroe asked for the bill. Richard approached confidently, placing the leather folder with the invoice on the table with a sharp thud. "I hope you enjoyed your experience," he commented, barely hiding his anticipation as he waited for them to open the folder and discover the hefty total. To his surprise, Mr. Monroe pulled out a fine leather wallet from his pocket, took out several high-denomination bills, and placed them alongside the bill, including a generous 20% tip. The food was excellent. "Thank you for your service," he said sincerely, standing up with dignity and offering his arm to Lucy. The young woman rose with natural grace, and both left the restaurant under the astonished gaze of Richard and the curious looks of the other diners. What no one in that restaurant knew was that Mr. John Monroe was not a simple farmer. He was the owner of Monroe Agribusiness, one of the most prosperous companies in the country, with vast lands in Michoacán and Jalisco. He had just closed a multi-million-dollar deal to export avocados to Europe and Asia, and had decided to celebrate discreetly with his daughter in the capital before returning to his estate. The next morning, the phone at the Golden Crown rang insistently. The restaurant's owner, Mr. Ernest Ford, a 60-year-old man with a neatly trimmed mustache and an impeccable reputation in Mexico's culinary world, answered personally. "Mr. John Monroe," he repeated incredulously as he listened. To his assistant, The magnate of Monroe Agribusiness was here last night, and no one told me? Mr. Ford's face paled as he learned that the businessman who had just signed a multi-million-dollar export contract had been treated like a second-class customer in his establishment. Worse still, his assistant informed him that Mr. Monroe had reserved again for that night, this time for a business dinner with several foreign investors. Prepare everything, Claudia. I want the best champagne, the freshest flowers, and tell Chef Sebastian to prepare something special, ordered Mr. Ford, wiping his sweaty forehead with a handkerchief. And please, call Richard. I need to speak with him immediately. In his apartment in the Roma neighborhood, Richard was sleeping soundly when his phone began to vibrate. Seeing his boss's name on the screen, he felt a chill run down his spine. "Yes, Mr. Ford?" he answered sleepily. "Richard, I need you to come to the restaurant right now. We have a situation." His boss's voice sounded tense, restrained. An hour later, Richard entered through the restaurant's back door, finding a visibly upset Mr. Ford. "Do you have any idea who the gentleman you seated by the kitchen last night was?" he asked without preamble. "The farmer and his daughter?" Richard replied disdainfully, recalling the simple man. "That farmer, as you call him, is Mr. John Monroe, owner of Monroe Agribusiness and one of the most influential businessmen in the country," explained Mr. Ford, watching as the color drained from Richard's face. "He just closed a multi-million-dollar export contract and is celebrating it here tonight, with investors coming specifically from Tokyo and Berlin to meet him." Richard felt the ground open beneath his feet. Suddenly he remembered the disdainful treatment, the mocking comments, the deliberate neglect. "Mr. Ford, I didn't know. I thought he was just a what, Richard? A customer who didn't deserve your respect because he wasn't wearing designer clothes," interrupted Mr. Ford, his disappointment palpable. "In this business, every customer deserves the same excellent treatment. That has always been my philosophy, and I thought it was yours too." The silence that followed was overwhelming. Richard realized in that moment the magnitude of his mistake, not just professionally but humanly. "Tonight you will personally serve Mr. Monroe and his guests," continued Mr. Ford, "and I expect you to demonstrate why you deserve to keep working in this restaurant." Meanwhile, in the presidential suite of the St. Regis Hotel, Mr. Monroe finished a video conference with his managers in Michoacan. Lucy entered the room, already dressed in an elegant outfit she had bought that morning. "Dad, are you sure you want to go back to that restaurant?" "We could go anywhere else," she suggested, recalling the discomfort of the previous night. Mr. Monroe looked at his daughter with tenderness. At 17, Lucy showed the same intelligence and sensitivity as her mother, who had passed away when the girl was just 5. Since then, she had been his pillar, his confidant, his greatest pride. "Sometimes, sweetheart, people need a second chance to show who they really are," he replied wisely. "Besides, the food was really good." Lucy smiled, recognizing in her father that unique ability to see beyond appearances and first impressions. "Do you know why I always dress like this when I'm traveling?" asked Mr. Monroe, adjusting the simple white shirt he wore. Lucy shook her head. "Because clothes don't define who I am. What I have here," he pointed to his heart, "and here," he touched his temple, "is what really matters. My father taught me that when I was your age, and it's something I've never forgotten." At 8 o'clock that night, a black limousine stopped in front of the Golden Crown. The valet hurried to open the door, and out stepped Mr. Monroe, now dressed in a tailored suit that highlighted his distinguished bearing. Beside him, Lucy shone in an emerald green dress that enhanced the golden tone of her skin and the jet black of her hair. Behind them, 3 businessmen also exited the vehicle. Takeshi Yamamoto, a Japanese investor with interest in the Asian market. Klaus Weber, a representative of a European supermarket chain. And Carlos Vega, Monroe Agribusiness's lawyer and a personal friend of Mr. Monroe. At the restaurant's entrance, Mr. Ford personally awaited them, with a nervous smile and slightly trembling hands. "Mr. Monroe, it's an honor to welcome you to my humble establishment," he greeted with an almost imperceptible bow. "We have reserved our best table for you and your distinguished guests." And so it was. In the center of the main dining room, Under the most impressive chandelier, a round table had been decorated with fresh floral arrangements and the finest French porcelain. Mr. Munro walked in with a firm step, nodding to Mr. Ford. His deep, brown eyes, reflecting years of experience, briefly scanned the restaurant, noticing that many of the diners from the previous night were there again. Some recognized him immediately, their expressions revealing surprise and a degree of shame for the disdainful glances of the previous evening. "Thank you for your welcome, Mr. Ford," he replied sincerely. "I've heard wonderful things about your restaurant, and last night I confirmed that your chef's reputation is well deserved." The restaurant owner nodded gratefully, though the blush on his cheeks betrayed his discomfort. As he led them to Beturi, the main table, he leaned discreetly toward Mr. Munro. "Allow me to offer my sincerest apologies for any inconvenience you experienced last night. I assure you it is not representative of the service we provide." Mr. Munro smiled slightly. "Don't worry. Sometimes appearances can be deceiving." Upon reaching the table, Mr. Ford personally pulled out the chair for Lucy, who thanked him with a radiant smile. The guests took their seats and Mr. Ford made an almost imperceptible gesture. Richard appeared then, impeccably dressed and with a serious expression that tried to hide his nervousness. His face visibly paled as he recognized Mr. Munro and Lucy. For a moment, his eyes met the businessman's, and in them he saw not the anger or contempt he expected, but a calm expectation. "Good evening, ladies and gentlemen," he greeted, his voice slightly trembling. "I'll be your waiter tonight. May I offer you something to drink to start?" For the next 2 hours, Richard performed with impeccable professionalism. Each dish was served with precision, each bottle uncorked with elegance, each question answered with knowledge and courtesy. His movements, however, revealed his tension, especially when serving Mr. Munro or Lucy. The dinner proceeded with lively conversations about the new export contract. Takeshi expressed his enthusiasm for introducing Mexican avocados to the Japanese market, while Klaus detailed distribution plans in Europe. Carlos, for his part, toasted to the success of the operation that would solidify Munro Agribusiness as a leader in the sector. "None of this would have been possible without the hard work of our farmers," Mr. Munro noted at one point. "My father started with just 10 hectares in Michoacán. He taught me that true value isn't in what you have, but in how you treat the people around you." Lucy watched her father with admiration. Despite his success and wealth, he had never lost his humility or his connection to his roots. It was this quality that inspired loyalty among his workers and respect among his competitors. As the dinner concluded and the guests enjoyed their desserts, Mr. Munro gestured to Richard. "Could I speak with you for a moment?" Richard, visibly nervous, nodded and approached. "Yes, sir? Please come with me," Mr. Munro requested, standing up and heading to a quieter area of the restaurant. Once there, away from curious eyes, Mr. Munro observed the young waiter, who seemed on the verge of fainting. "Mr. Munro, I want to apologize for my behavior last night," Richard began, his voice breaking. "I have no excuse for treating you and your daughter that way. It was disrespectful and completely inappropriate." The businessman looked at him in silence for a few seconds that felt like an eternity to Richard. "Do you know why I came back today?" he finally asked. Richard shook his head, unable to meet his gaze. "Because everyone deserves a second chance," Mr. Munro replied calmly. "And because I wanted to show you something important. Last night, when I walked in dressed simply, I saw how I was judged by my appearance. Today, in this suit, I receive bows, but I'm the same person." Richard looked up, surprised by the absence of reproach in the businessman's voice. "My father was a laborer in the avocado fields before becoming the owner of his own land," Mr. Munro continued. "He taught me that respect isn't given based on the clothes someone wears or the money they seem to have. It's given because all human beings deserve it." The words struck a chord with Richard, who felt a lump form in his throat. "What you learn from this is up to you," Mr. Munro concluded. "But remember, in life people will remember how you made them feel, not what clothes you wore or what car you drove." They returned to the table, where the guests had finished their desserts, As the evening ended, Mr. Munro asked for the bill. Mr. Ford hurried to indicate that the dinner was on the house, but the businessman insisted on paying. "A prosperous business is built on fair dealings," he stated with a smile. When Richard brought the folder with the bill, Mr. Munro paid and once again left a generous tip. Before leaving, he addressed the young man. "Have you learned something today?" he asked kindly. Richard, moved, nodded. "Yes, sir, that respect is the foundation of everything." Mr. Munro smiled, satisfied. "Exactly, and never underestimate anyone because you never know who that simple person walking through the door might be." The next day, Mr. Ford implemented new policies at the Golden Crown. All customers, regardless of their appearance, were to receive the same excellent treatment. Richard, for his part, was assigned to an intensive customer service training program with an emphasis on professional ethics. Weeks later, when Mr. Munro and Lucy returned to Mexico City for another engagement, they decided to dine again at the Golden Crown. To their satisfaction, they noticed a significant change in the atmosphere. The staff, including Richard, attended to all diners with the same courtesy and efficiency, from celebrities to budget-conscious tourists. At the end of the dinner, Richard approached their table. "Mr. Munro, Miss Lucy, it's been a pleasure serving you tonight," he said sincerely. "I wanted to thank you for the lesson you taught me. It's changed my life, not just professionally." Lucy smiled, recalling the words her father always repeated. "True wealth lies in how we treat others." And as Mr. Munro and his daughter left the restaurant under the stars of Mexico City, the businessman reflected on the power of a well-learned lesson. Sometimes a small act of dignity and respect could trigger a profound change.